The valley of gloom shrouded in nervous silence. But ironically, the relatively empty streets and the lifelessness in Srinagar may actually be a source of some relief. For weeks now, anger has spilt out onto the streets, raw, defiant of the curfew, unbothered even by the possibility of death. Today too, on the outskirts of the city, protesters broke the curfew, setting abandoned police cars ablaze to mark their rage against civilian killings. In the crowds and on the streets now, not just hundreds of women, but also teenage boys and even little children, raising their fists in an alarming image of accelerated adulthood. Like it or not, these are the children of conflict, crushed and caught inextricably in the cycle of violence. And inside hospitals across the city are their untold tragedies. Like 19-year-old Munir Ahmed from Kupwara, battling injuries from 2 bullets in the thigh and the ankle. A higher secondary student who does not say very much except to whisper to us that he dreams of becoming a school teacher one day. साल की पढ़ाई करते हैं? हाँ। आगे क्या करना चाहते हैं? आपका सपना क्या है? ठीक है लगेगा। हाँ? मुझे कार्ड की करना। हाँ बताओ। क्या आगे जाके क्या करना चाहते हैं? मास्टर बनना चाहता हूँ। ऊंचा बोले? मास्टर बनना चाहता हूँ। हाँ? मास्टर बनना चाहता हूँ। मास्टर? हाँ। टीचर बनना चाहते हैं? But he does say, yes, he was part of a stone-pelting crowd of protesters. So should a teenager, a boy really, despite his 19 years, have been out on the streets instead of in school? We ask the elders in his family. खूब अभी ये डिबेट चल रही है कि लोगों को जब जुलूस निकालते हैं उनको पत्थर का इस्तेमाल करना चाहिए या नहीं। पुलिस वाले कहते हैं वो पत्थर मारेंगे हमें गोली मारनी पड़ेगी। तो इसके बारे में आपका क्या ख्याल है? मैम पहले हमारे पास बंदूक थी और जब उस वक्त भी हम लोगों को मारा, कहा इनकाउंटर मार गया। अब क्या कहेंगे पुलिस वाले? पत्थर उठाएंगे और उधर से गोली चलती है। ये कहाँ का इंसाफ है? It is this adamant anger that is drawing young people out on the streets that the government will have to find a way of tackling. But most tragic is the story of the children who are suffering just because they were in the wrong place at the wrong time. In fact, it all began with the death of 17-year-old Tufail Mattu, who was merely walking back home from school when a tear gas shell burst open his skull. These posters in his house only underline the unraveling tragedy of Kashmir. Tufail is not the only one. Today in this hospital we meet a distraught mother, unable to leave the bedside of her 15-year-old son. Amir Ashraf from a village in Bandipur was leaving the local madrasa after reading the Qur'an when a bullet ripped open his leg and dislocated his hip. He says he has never been part of any street protest ever. स्कूल में पढ़ते हो? हाँ। कौन सी क्लास में? 9th में। और वैसे जब ये जुलूस वगैरह होते हैं आप हिस्सा लेते हो उनमें? नहीं। कभी भी नहीं? कभी भी नहीं लिया? अभी दर्द हो रही है टांग में? हाँ हाँ बहुत पेन। तो कैसे कहाँ से फायरिंग लगी आपको? हाँ? जब आप मदरसा जा रहे थे क्या देखा आपने सड़क पे? मैंने देखा फायरिंग हो रही है और मैं रास्ते से तेज चल गया था। Midway through talking to us, he is suddenly unable to speak. The memory of that day and the wound just too painful. The tragedy of these young lives that captures the present crisis in a single stark image. Like this funeral procession that drew thousands onto the streets. Victim, a 9-year-old child, Samir Ahmed, now officially the youngest casualty in the recent violence. The police says he died in a stampede created by a mob of protesters. His family says he was beaten to death. But no matter which narrative you choose to believe, no matter whether they suffer as protesters or as innocent bystanders. This is the chilling truth of the lives lived by the children of conflict and the ultimate tragedy of Kashmir today. Out on the streets of Srinagar today, a tense and a quiet calm. A calm but not a peace, on a day when the curfew finally seems to have been effective, or at least somewhat effective. But inside the different hospitals of the city, the tragic stories of the injured. Perhaps the most depressing and disturbing dimension of the recent strife, the almost unbreakable cycle of violence, has been the fact that several of the deaths have been those of teenagers and even little children, the youngest and most recent being the death of a 9-year-old child. The government has made a formal appeal to protesters to not bring or use children as part of the street protests. But what of those who were not even protesting but still had to suffer? Whether it was the story of Tufail Mattu that actually marked the beginning of this cycle of violence, or the story we saw today of 15-year-old Amir Ashraf, it is these families, civilians, ordinary people who need some visible empathy from the political leaders, both in the state government and in New Delhi. In Srinagar, Barkha Dutt for NDTV.